Hello everyone. Welcome to my last lecture in this ethnobotany course. And this lecture is called Applied Ethnobotany because I'd like to take you on a little trip through the sort of a behind the scenes look of ethnobotany as a field, and specifically pulling from a couple of examples from my own experience with this field of study. So this lecture contains two parts. The first is called Ethnobotany in Practice, and this is again about the baka. You've heard about them before, last Friday. But this time I'd like to take you sort of behind the scenes to have a look at how setting up a research project works. What are all the things you have to take care of when you do such a thing. And I'd like to basically take you through the whole process from a proposal to a finished product, and that is then a paper. The second section, the second part, is about applying ethnobotanical methods in other places than ethnobotanical research pur sang, you could say. What I've found through my experiences with the things I've done, projects I've done, is that the things you learn during this course and that you practice can be very useful in other places, such as consultancy work, where you have to find out stuff about a situation in a local place. Also in ecological field work, that kind of stuff. So I'd like to really take you on a couple of trips, basically, and show you where these skills can be applied. Now this lecture really pulls from my own experience, and I thought that would be a refreshing look for you, and I hope that you enjoy that, and that you get a bit of an insight into the way you might use the things you learn here. So let's get into the baka story again, but now from a different angle. The main thing that I wanna talk to you about in this first section is taking a research project from the first plan, the inception, basically, to the final product. And I've sort of identified three phases in this process. This is my own idea, but so it's not written in stone. But I thought that there are really three phases, mainly the preparation phase, the data collection and processing phase, which I've just shortened to data to make it clearer, and the writing and publishing phase. And with the baka project, this whole process took maybe a bit over a year, maybe even a bit longer, until it was finally finished. Actually, now that I think of it, the writing and publishing phase is still going on. But I'll show you that in a bit. So really, you see in the bottom left here the title of my research proposal, all the way back in September of 2018, in which I was really keen on looking at the disturbance in the Congo rainforest, and the effects that this had on the baka diet. And this has evolved all the way to a couple of articles, of which the one we're trying to publish now is the importance of choosing the right method for assessing wild food plant knowledge and use. So a bit of a different focus, and like I say, it evolves, and I'd like to take you into that process. And it all starts with an idea, of course. When I first got involved with Tinde and Sandrine and the Baka project, I had known Tinde for a while already, and she had been in touch with Sandrine, and they were discussing about going to Cameroon, going back to the Baka, because Sandrine had already been there for a while earlier, and really collecting all the plants that they were using, because she had been performing free listing exercises. She had been performing dietary recalls as well, so really thorough interview methods. But she was trying to publish about this, and the paper wouldn't accept it because there was too Really the gold standard, they said, in ethnobotany is collecting plant vouchers. So you cannot just say we found this and this plant without backing it up with making a voucher collection. So when Tinde and Sandrine got talking, they said, well, maybe we should organize a trip to Cameroon to collect these samples and to do some more research. Tinde at one point proposed this to me, and she said, well, we're gonna look for a student. Maybe that's something you would like to do. So I gave that some thought, and I started with really looking into this field of study. I've been doing ethnobotany for a while, but as in I had been interested in ethnobotany for a while, but I'd never really been researching ethnobotanical studies before, aside from this course, of course. So I looked into the baka and wild edible plants and started with this intellectual pursuit of trying to find out what was happening over there and what my role in this could be, as in what would a researcher look at, what is important. And this eventually led to defining some research questions, of course, in collaboration with Tinde and Sandrine, which I developed into a proposal. Well, that was the intellectual part of the starting. But there are, of course, also very practical things that you have to take care of. So once we had decided that we were going to go, there's a planning that has to be made. You have to know when you're going to go. But there are a lot of things that, on the practical aspects that come into play here, like finding an accommodation to sleep, having all the gear in place, but also getting your visum and other important documents. And there's some financial aspects too. So let's have a look at these practical aspects. Like I said, a time frame is very important. Ask yourself, when are we going to go? And we made a preliminary planning that would start with us meeting at Tinde's house in Amsterdam, and then in April of 2019, the 1st of April, flying there to Cameroon. And what you have to think about here as well is, of course, what season am I traveling in? Because you don't want to be traveling in the middle of the rainy season, for example, or, well, you could, but this makes it more difficult. So take the location into account. We arranged transportation by the means likes of Alain, our driver you see in the picture here. And he also helped us with gathering all the supplies that we needed. So we went shopping once we had arrived in Yaoundé. We had, of course, a whole list of things we had to arrange, and not the least of which was newspaper. And that was something that, in Tinde's experience, was very difficult to get in West Africa. But we managed to arrange everything. We filled out the list, and after a couple of days, we were ready to go. So I'm showing you just the start of this whole planning here, but of course it was much longer because we stayed in total for 25 days in Cameroon. Right, one last thing that you have to take care of course, and that you have to take care of as well, is permits. You cannot leave the country with your plant samples without having the proper permits to take them with you. And this may be complicated, but often you work together with a local herbarium, a local research institute that will help you with getting these permits, and also of course have some influence on what is being researched. And in this case, we work together with the herbarium of Yaoundé. I think that's the main, or maybe even the only herbarium in Cameroon. And with Professor Sonke, who is a very kind man and was very interested in our studies as well. So really, it's important to also get in touch with the local people and the people that are in your field locally, so to say. Right. Aside from practical things, once you know when you're going to stay there, it's also very important to get the money that you need, of course. And this is almost one of the side jobs of a researcher. I found that most researchers have plenty of research ideas, but very little money to actually make them happen. And getting the money to do such research like this requires some lobbying here and there to get it together. Well, for me, within this project, I was, like I mentioned, working together with Tinde and Sandrine, who both had their own funds to get this going. Tinde, for example, she applied at the Treub Foundation, who give away grants for ethnobotanical research or botanical research. I'm not sure actually. And Sandrine was still working on the Harvest project, which is an ERC grant, so European Research Council grant. So they both had their money, but I didn't. But of course, luckily there's a lot of funds that you can apply to as a student in ethnobotany to help you get to the place that you need to be and to help you do your research. In my case, I did my grant request at the Alberta Menninga Foundation, who have a maximum of 1,250 euros that they can spend on you. And well, of course, it's very important when you do this that you have proper support. So you have to have the people at the university that you're working with, like for me, de Weur. You have to have them to back you up, and also your immediate supervisors, of course. And Tinde was so kind to write a letter of approval or a letter of recommendation for me, which made it easier to I suppose to get this grant. And besides getting a good proposal, so having the literary stuff all worked out, you also have to have the practical things arranged, and you have to know what you're going to be spending the money on. So a good budget is very important when you apply for a grant. One of the things that I learned from Tinde is when you apply for a grant and you insert your budget, always include in the budget what your own contribution is going to be. So always write down what you are going to put in, so that the people know, okay, this person is really planning on contributing himself as well. One last thing to remember when you're traveling, pretty obvious, but have good travel insurance. This turned out to be fundamental in my trip. I won't go into it too much, but I fell ill during this trip, during the field work. So I had pretty huge medical costs, and this travel insurance that I had, which doesn't cost too much, like for €4 a month or something, really repaid most of the travel expenses that were related to this medical issue. So get good travel insurance, and it doesn't cost that much. Now the data collection can begin. And you have a plan already, of course, so now you can just start following it, and pretty soon you'll arrive at the conclusion that your plan is faulty. Generally, it's very good to be flexible when you're working on a research plan, because conditions will always change when you're in the field. As I mentioned, I fell ill, and from the 25 days that we had in Cameroon, we spent only 14 collecting plants. Walk in the woods. Luckily, as you can see in the species accumulation curve in the bottom left corner, we actually collected a lot of species in those 14 days, and we hit the top, we hit the plateau, which means that we had collected everything. Well, this required us to be quite flexible in our research planning. For example, we went back to the capital twice, I think, or once, and then got back to the field again. So once you start collecting plants, the puzzle starts. Like you can see here, we had a list of the plant species we had to collect on the wall, and we started striping them off once we got them. and this really gives a clear objective. Okay, we need to get these species, but you of course you get local species, local names mostly, and then the puzzle starts in getting the scientific names to match up with these species. And that's actually a thing you can already start doing while you're there. You have the most of the input ready, but it continues when you get back home. And once you're back home, you get this huge jambalaya of species that still have to be identified in the picture you saw before. And this eventually leads to a data set with all the different species in there and lots of other information, such as how is it used, what kind of tree is it, what kind of life form is it. And if you're putting this together, you can already start seeing some patterns maybe. In this case, we saw a pattern that there were a lot of tree species being used, and there were a lot more species than we had initially expected used in this location. And from this observation, you can start. Of course, you've read a lot about the subject, so you compare this with the literature that you read, and we found out that there was kind of a discrepancy between what the literature cited and what we had found. Many pieces of literature said that biodiversity in a place doesn't really contribute to the diet. And these studies we found were mostly based on free listing and dietary recall studies, while with our walk in the woods study we found different results. And this was a key insight that Tin initially had, and helped me realize as well that a lot of this research about wild plants and the use of those by people is actually kind of biased by the method they use. Using free listing, for example, as a technique is really dependent on, you can imagine it's dependent on where you are, what species you can remember, and going into the woods with an informant will really give you a different view. So there was a story there, and this story we tried to develop further. Once you know what your story is going to be, it's important to look at what you can claim based on your data, and how well you can substantiate this. Really, especially when you're trying to publish a paper, it's important that you know how far your data go and what you can say based on it. And this is a process that you do together with your supervisors, of course. They often know a lot more about this than you do, than I do in this case. And that was really an interesting find for me, that this is a very iterative process. So it's really bouncing one draft to your supervisors and bouncing it back again and crafting your story based on that. And once my master thesis was done and I delivered my report, then the idea was to develop this further into a scientific article. And on the bottom left here, you see my master thesis report, and the study I had done was really not there yet. So the thesis report itself was not enough to just give it to a publisher and publish it, and that makes sense because I'm just a master student. But working together with Sandrine and Tinde, and also Amanda Henry, who is Sandrine's supervisor, we eventually came to something that we could publish and that we could submit for publication at least. And that's where we are now. We've put this manuscript we've submitted it to Frontiers, who has a special issue coming up on wild edible plants. And what we found there, just as a little insight, is that we got some pushback from the people that reviewed the manuscript, because the people that reviewed the manuscript were also people that were very reliant on the techniques that we had sort of no, well, not disproven, but we had criticized in our article. So we got it back saying, okay, this is too polemic. This is too much from one perspective, and you have to balance it out a little bit more. And in this way, slowly the article develops into something that will be published eventually. When you are working on such a thing, it's always important to look at what journal you can use to publish in, and what the fit will be. So there's journals that are easier to publish in, and journals that are more difficult to publish in, and they all also have their own frame of what are we going to publish. And some examples you see here: Society for Economic Botany has Economic Botany as a paper, which is not as easy to publish in, but the bottom one, +1, is very broad and very generalistic, and they're a lot more open to any article, basically. But they also therefore accept ethnobotanical research. Right, so that was that on the whole writing and publishing process. Now I'd like to take you to the next part, which is ethnobotanical methods in other fields. What I really want to show you with this section is how you can apply the ethnobotanical methods that we discussed and practiced during this course in other places and in other projects and other efforts. And really going further even than the methods is this framework, this way of looking at things that we've been using, that really takes the local focus and asks local people about what they think instead of imposing it from the top down. I want to give you mainly a couple of examples from my own experience, 3 examples actually, and I hope that you find them useful in your opinion about how you can use these things that we learned. So I want to take you first to the island of St. Eustatius, which you see here. It's an island in the Caribbean, and pretty small one at that, and it's a very beautiful place. But it has one key problem. There is a plant called Corallita, which grows on this island, and it overgrows large parts of this island. It's a plant that occurs in other places as well. For example, on other islands in the Caribbean, but it's originally from Mexico, and it's a very invasive plant. Antigonon leptopus in Latin, it's family of the Polygonaceae, which is the same family as Japanese knotweed, which is a very invasive plant in the Netherlands and in Europe in general. So I got into this research project a couple of years ago when I was talking with the University of Utrecht, with some researchers there who were trying to find a solution for this noxious weed, they called it. And I was discussing with them how to solve it, and herbicides have been used, and this had been used, and that had been used, and it didn't work. And when I first talked to Tinde about it, when I was initially doing this course, she said, wait, but you just gotta get rid of the goats and plant some trees. And I thought, huh? What? How can you get rid of a plant by planting trees? What turned out to be the issue was that there was a lot going on this island that didn't have anything to do with the Corallita, but Corallita was kind of the result of this. I got an opportunity to go there after a while when I was studying with Tinde and doing this as my bachelor thesis. And I talked to the local people about this plant and their experience with it. And they told me, well, it overgrows the native vegetation. Well, this I had heard before. But they also told me that it's the first thing that comes up again when the rain comes. It's the first thing... it's a drought-resistant plant. That's basically what they said. And another thing that you heard about across the island was a goat is a vote. Now this I'll clarify. This island is originally didn't have any herbivores in its, or at least not the big ones like goats. But when the colonization efforts got underway, they at one point took goats, took sheep. I think I've also seen cows, as you've seen in the picture, and for food, of course. And they introduced this to the island fauna, and these became kind of a problem. And they went feral. They went all over the island and started chewing on everything. And apparently, there's also, as a result, one of the suspicions Tinder had was that this Corallita was actually caused by the fact that there were lots of goats roaming all over the island. Well, a goat is a vote is something that came up because apparently these goats also became politicized, and politicians that wanted to get rid of them were really voted away, or not voted for, as these goats were kind of seen as a backup food mechanism. So here you see that what local people tell you about a problem can really inform your perspective on it. Looking in the literature, we could find a lot of factors that were contributing to the fact that lots of areas of St. Eustatius were overgrown with Corallita. They were dominated by Corallita. The first factor was overgrazing. The many feral animals, especially goats, were really eating everything except for Corallita. And this, of course, gives a competitive advantage to the Corallita plants. Anthropogenic disturbance was also mentioned by 19 different papers as one of the causes. And what anthropogenic disturbance really means, it's a fancy word for people messing up the environment in some places. So, for example, there were lots of building projects that were halfway finished and left there, so with bare soil. There were agricultural fields that were left at one point just without any cover, which were easy prey, of course, for a plant like this, and they could quickly overgrow all this open bare soil. Lastly, there was climate change. It was pointed by 6 authors as one of the, or 6 papers as one of the leading causes of this problem. And this was mainly St. Eustatius doesn't have a dry season. It's wet all year round, but there are dry periods. Not really a full season, but there are periods that are a bit drier. And climate change, as these authors mentioned, was causing longer dry periods. And this coincided with the insight that the local people had told me. And they said that Corallita is the first thing that sprouts when the rain comes again. Now, when we published this information, it was really a strange conclusion that what was once thought to be a real big problem, the Corallita itself, actually turned out to be more of a symptom of the way that people had been interacting with their environment on this island. Not necessarily on purpose, of course, but the goats, for example, they don't belong on St. Eustatius. They were brought there in colonial times as food, as a food supply. The anthropogenic disturbance also had a social reason, mainly that people had stopped practicing agriculture at one point, all of a sudden, and this left large parts of the island uncovered. So what was once thought to be a problem species, you could say, now turns out to be more of a symptom of the ongoing problems with the environment and the people-plant interactions. A second example of using ethnobotanical skills in an applied context is with this project, a sustainable agriculture project I did with in Uganda. At one point during my master, I got together with 2 other students and we formed sort of a consultancy group kind of thing called Passiflora Network, from the idea that we wanted to bridge the gap between the scientific knowledge that is not widely available. There's a lot of scientific knowledge, and we want to be sort of the bridge towards the application of this in places where it's may be useful, especially because people in developing countries cannot really access this kind of knowledge. And in this example, we focused on a dairy farm in Kumi, and this is somewhere in the northeast of Uganda, where there was very low milk production. They had a couple of actually quite a lot of cows, but they didn't produce too much milk. And the original hypothesis was that this was due to low feed production. There was too little and bad quality feed. So we went there with the idea, with the project goal of trying to identify strategies for creating a more sustainable farming system with better guarantee at milk and everything, and also a more circular system, more of a circle of nitrogen, for example, connecting all the different inputs and outputs. And during this research process, we were attacking a couple of issues at the farm. One of them was low quality fodder. There was too little food for the cattle to eat. There was too little shade as well, especially with the breed of cows that they were using. And termites were a big problem. When you put a wooden pole into the ground in this place, it will be eaten within 2.5 years, something like that. And it will completely disappear because the termites ate it. And that's a big issue when you try to build fences to contain cows. So at one point I went into the field and tried to collect all the trees that I could find, because I thought trees may provide a good solution, and especially native trees. And this is where the ethnobotanical aspect comes in, because when I had collected a couple of those trees, I took home all the branches, and it turned out that the best way to identify what tree species we were talking about was to just ask the local people. Already when I was in the field, there were a lot of people who came to ask me what in God's name I was doing, because I was ripping off branches of random trees here and there in the field. But when I got home, the ones I couldn't identify, I was helped with by a lady called Aunt Anne, who was kind of our hostess. She lived in the houses you see here. And she helped us along with identifying these plant species. So she could provide us with the local names, and she told us whether they were evergreen, semi-deciduous, or whether, for example, they bore edible fruit. And with the local names, I actually found a tree guide of a researcher that had translated these local names to Latin, and so in this way I could find out what Latin names of the species there were. And then you see that when you look at the local tree species, such as the first one, Diospyros mespiliformis, that was actually a tree that is very termite resistant and very capable of standing in a field. Actually, it lived with a termite mound underneath it, so it lived sort of in harmony with the termites. And this was a possible solution at least for the termite problem, because you can, if you plant these trees as posts, you can use them as a living fence. Same goes for the other species. There were nitrogen fixers that also had edible leaves that the cows could chew on. There were trees that were evergreen, so that they could provide shade for the cows, and so the local biodiversity kind of held the key to getting a more circular, a better system going there. And this process I wrote down at the bottom of collecting the plants and identifying them. Then you can research them either from local knowledge from local people, supplemented with whatever is said online by the scientists, and then this is ready for application. Of course, like I mentioned, this was a consultancy project, and we tried to bundle this knowledge and give it back. But the application itself we didn't do. Right. Another ethnobotanical aspect is asking questions, and specifically for this farm, we wanted to know what crops would be a good thing to grow. We went to local markets and we asked them, what crop would you grow? What is the most expensive crop? For example, we found out that sesame seeds, so simsim, it's called over there, is a very valuable crop to produce, and that was a suggestion for the crop producing part of this farm. Other ways we applied interviewing skills is in finding out what farming methods were used in the environment by other farmers, for example, and to find out what the best seed prices were, because at one point I had traveled back to Kampala to figure out how to get the right seeds for the farm, and I went around the city all the way to interview people, or to ask in markets, hey, can you deliver this seed, and for what price would you do it? And those experiences were really I drew on the interviewing skills that I got from ethnobotany, from this course. Now, the last project I want to tell you about is one that I worked on for Passiflora as well. This is a cattle ranch in the south of Brazil, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. And this place is famous for its many cows, but also for its deforestation, because there used to be quite a lot of forest in this state. That is part of the Mata Atlantica, the Atlantic rainforest, or Atlantic forest, I should say. And this is actually one of the worst hit forests in the world. You should look into it. It's very the deforestation rate is way higher than Amazon or the Congo Basin rainforest. And we worked here for the local farmers to identify ways to reforest the land. This is in a collaboration with a Dutch company that really wants to give farmers an alternative to just having bare land, growing GMO soy, for example, or keeping cattle. They want to provide an alternative by sequestering carbon in this forest. So we went there to develop a sustainable reforestation strategy for the lots of degraded farmland that is present there. And here it was really important that we had a look at the perceptions of the local people, because you cannot just come in from the outside and say, hey, you should grow forest here, you shouldn't do what you're doing now, you should do this and that. That's not the way it works. So we really had to find out what local people thought about forests, what they thought about farming and their way of life. So we did a lot of interviews with landowners, but also with farmers that had smaller pieces of land, and we got lots of different responses. So, for instance, some people called the bush sujeira, dirt or filth, and their perception of bush was that it wasn't productive, and they didn't have any use for it. So you might as well clear it and put some soy or some cows there, because that will make you money. But on the other hand, some people really had the perception that they lived in harmony with nature in this place, and that it was really their duty to be involved also with nature. And related to the project, we also asked, would you consider planting back more trees? And then, of course, it becomes a question of livelihood as well. If you want to grow, get trees back on a piece of land, you're taking a part of that land that's not going to be available for farming anymore. So they mentioned that it would only be considered if they earn more money by doing it than by not doing it. And that makes sense, of course. But analyzing what people think in a place is really important in any project, I think, and it's way too often forgotten to really see what people in a local place think about the thing you're trying to do. Another important aspect, of course, is understanding the ecosystem you're in. And this is sort of like what I mentioned before about Uganda, that you look in the field about what the local tree species are and whether they're useful. Here we did the same thing. We analyzed, or we collected especially trees that were very abundant, and we tried to identify them. The same way again, by having the local people help us out in identifying these species. That's really almost a shortcut, because they often have good local names, and there's also local floras that mention this name and connect it to a Latin name. So that's an easy way to find out what species are being discussed. And then you can go and research them and see what useful properties they may have. But more widely, it was important, and I wrote it here as social ecosystem, because I think that this was not an ecosystem that was very free of human intervention. And there was really an interplay between farmer and nature, whether that's in a good way or in a bad way. And in lots of places there was regrowing vegetation like this that you see on the left here. And we by asking the farmer, we could also identify the ways he had been treating his land, and what was going well, what was going wrong, etc. And in this way we got a really proper picture of how the ecosystem works, but also how the farming system works. And taking those together is important when you want to when you want to change anything. So concluding this presentation, I'd like to say that research projects, and especially ethnobotanical research projects, are quite complex, but they're very feasible to perform if you have great help. Ethnobotanical skills, like I hope I've demonstrated in the second part, are very useful in also in other fields, not only in ethnobotany per se, but also in consultancy about farming, or in ecological research, etc. And I think that a good thing to do is to just be confident and ask questions. When you're in a place and you start asking questions, people generally respond very positively, and they like that you are curious about their way of life and about their environment. So really, don't be afraid to ask questions. And I hope that mainly I've shown that the relationship between plants and people, it's just everywhere, and it's so relevant, especially today when we have so many environmental problems that need a solution. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. This one was a bit longer than the previous two lectures I did, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. And see you soon.